The inception of the modern era is often attributed to colonization, a period marked by the expansion of colonial powers such as Britain, Portugal, Spain, and France, as they extended their influence and control over vast oceans. Various continents, spanning numerous centuries, evolved into focal points for colonial empires. There was a pervasive notion that, at a certain juncture, the global landscape would be predominantly characterized by either colonies or colonizers. This frequently prompts contemplation about the reasons certain countries remained untouched during the expansive colonial period. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Thailand, and Ethiopia were among the select few nations that emerged from this era without succumbing to foreign dominance, unlike the Americas, certain regions in Africa, and parts of Asia. Another sovereign state that skillfully evaded colonial subjugation was Japan. The initial consideration that arises when pondering why Japan avoided colonization might be the historical fact that they themselves evolved into a colonial empire at one juncture. This observation indeed holds merit. In the 1870s and 80s, following the acquisition of control over the Nanpo, Ryukyu, and Kuril Islands, the Japanese Empire redirected its focus to more distant territories. The initial addition to this expansion was Taiwan, brought under the Japanese crown through a treaty signed at the conclusion of the First Sino-Japanese War. Subsequently, Japan aligned itself with Western colonial powers in the pursuit of East Asian expansion, ultimately annexing Korea and establishing its identity as a colonizer rather than a colony. Throughout the 20th century, Japan persistently advanced along this trajectory, annexing Sakhalin, certain German colonial territories like the Caroline Islands, and Manchuria. The Japanese colonial empire reached its conclusion in 1945, coinciding with the conclusion of World War II. However, during its existence, the empire's expansions made the notion of anyone colonizing Japan seem utterly absurd. For approximately 5 decades, the primary reason Japan avoided colonization was due to its role as a colonizer. Although this explanation is evident and forms a compelling argument, it encompasses less than a full century. The colonial era had already spanned hundreds of years before Japan emerged as a colonial power. During this interim period, what deterred intruders from Japan? Despite not being entirely free from European interference, Japan did experience contact with outsiders. The Portuguese were the initial Europeans to set foot in Japan in 1543 when a group of Portuguese traders anchored their ship on Nipponese shores. This marked the commencement of a new relationship between Japan and Portugal, primarily focused on economic matters, but religion swiftly became a significant aspect of the discourse as well. Commerce played a pivotal role in the Portuguese influence over Japan. The majority of their traded goods originated from China, a nation that Japan had been unable to directly engage with due to an embargo imposed by the Chinese emperor. This circumstance meant that the Portuguese possessed commodities highly coveted by the Japanese but inaccessible through direct channels. It established a seamless system that operated effectively for several decades. The Japanese could acquire coveted items such as silk and porcelain from China without relying on Chinese merchants directly, while the Portuguese concurrently expanded their influence further into Asia. Firearms emerged as a sought-after acquisition for the Japanese, particularly during the Sengoku period of civil war. However, not all of Portugal's initiatives in Japan proved advantageous for the locals. Soon after their arrival, the Portuguese initiated a prosperous slave trade, involving the purchase of Japanese citizens, particularly women, who were then sold to Europeans abroad. This burgeoning business rapidly expanded but swiftly raised concerns within the contemporary Portuguese monarchy. King Sebastian feared that the growing market would tarnish Portugal's evangelical Catholic reputation, especially as they sought to introduce Christianity into Japan. Reluctant to tolerate further complications, Sebastian issued a ban on the slave trade in 1571, though its impact was minimal. The trade persisted, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, renowned as the Great Unifier of Japan, grew increasingly frustrated with the ongoing situation. Observing his people being sold in large numbers, he took action by writing a letter to Gaspar Coelho, the Portuguese Jesuit vice-provincial, insisting that this trade must cease, and all slaves should be repatriated to Japan. Certain historians perceive Hideyoshi's anger as somewhat hypocritical, considering that he was concurrently involved in a large-scale slave trade, albeit with Korean prisoners of war rather than his own Japanese people. Despite Hideyoshi's escalating anger, he started attributing blame specifically to the Portuguese Jesuits. This outcome was precisely what King Sebastian had sought to prevent, but his actions had proved insufficient. Frustrated, Hideyoshi went so far as to prohibit Christian evangelization in Japan. The official ban on the slave trade only came in 1595, and the entire episode had significantly strained the relationship between Japan and Portugal. The Japanese now perceived the Portuguese, especially the Jesuits, as a significant threat to Japan's sovereignty. By the 17th century, any potential colonial threat had been completely severed, and the Portuguese refrained from pushing further boundaries. While Japan had some potential benefits to offer the Portuguese and other European powers, the cost of resisting was deemed too high. In reality, forcibly colonizing Japan appeared nearly impossible. The Japanese had not only acquired a significant quantity of firearms from the Portuguese, but had also acquired the knowledge to manufacture their own. Given the demands imposed by the Civil War period, the Japanese were well prepared and fully capable of defending themselves in battle. Moreover, Japan was a vast country with a sizable population, particularly in comparison to Portugal. Even for larger European powers, the prospect would have posed more challenges than benefits, especially considering the considerable distance between Japan and Europe. Attempting to transport substantial numbers of troops, enough to rival the local population, from any part of Europe to the Japanese archipelago would have been a daunting task, if not entirely unfeasible. The lack of sufficient incentive further discouraged such endeavors. When it came to trade, natural resources, or compelling motivations, Japan fell short. It lacked unique offerings that Europeans couldn't find or acquire elsewhere, especially from their existing colonies. This factor in itself served as another deterrent against any significant European attempts to colonize Japan. Portugal, Spain, and other colonial powers were preoccupied with managing their existing colonies. To divert attention and resources toward a new territory, it would have needed to be exceptionally attractive, more so than Japan was at the time. The existing colonial commitments and priorities proved a further impediment to any serious consideration of Japan as a viable target for colonization. Finally, Europe was far from a bastion of peace on multiple fronts. The assortment of colonial monarchies across the continent were not uniformly allied. Competition among them was not only expected, but frequent. European wars were not rare occurrences. This not only kept Portugal and other colonial powers preoccupied, but also exposed them to the risk of conflict with rival European nations if any of them seriously contemplated a venture into the colonization of Japan. The turbulent European geopolitical landscape further discouraged any decisive efforts in that direction. Additionally, European powers had to contend with external threats, notably the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire posed a much closer and more immediate menace to all of Europe compared to Japan. The Ottomans actively sought to expand and consolidate power in ways that directly clashed with European colonial ambitions. This geopolitical reality kept Portugal and their rivals extensively occupied, diverting attention away from Japan. it significantly raised the threshold for what Japan would need to offer to make colonization a worthwhile endeavor in the midst of competing with more pressing concerns posed by the Ottoman threat. Indeed, the resilience of Japan in avoiding colonization can be attributed to a combination of luck and the inherent strength of the Japanese. Geographical luck played a role, positioning the archipelago far away from major colonial powers and acting as a natural barrier. Additionally, the lack of abundant resources that might attract European conquerors was also a stroke of luck for Japan. The convergence of these factors, along with the tenacity and preparedness of the Japanese, formed a formidable defense against the colonial ambitions of the time. Furthermore, the numerical and military strength of the Japanese, even centuries before they became a colonial power themselves, placed the Europeans at an undeniable disadvantage in the hypothetical scenario of an invasion. When Japan eventually transformed into a colonial empire, this marked the conclusive chapter in the story of potential colonization. The tables had turned, and the Japanese now held the reins of power rather than being overpowered. While there may have been a precarious window of opportunity for the Portuguese to attempt colonization when they first arrived in the 16th century, the odds likely favored the Japanese even then. Even if Portugal had not undermined its own opportunities by initiating the slave trade, or if King Sebastian had acted earlier in banning the market, success in a colonization attempt would still have been far from guaranteed. It's probable that even if these specific circumstances had not gone awry, other challenges or obstacles would likely have arisen, making the prospect of successful colonization of Japan highly uncertain. The combination of various factors, as well as the intrinsic difficulties in colonizing Japan, would have posed substantial challenges regardless of specific historical developments. Exactly. Japan avoided colonization not because it was impossible, but due to the overwhelming risks and sacrifices required for any colonial power attempting such an endeavor. In a historical twist, Japan eventually emerged as a colonizer itself, and the Japanese archipelago remained largely untouched by external colonial forces, aside from the brief period of Portuguese influence. The unique historical circumstances, combined with Japan's own strength and resilience, played a crucial role in shaping its trajectory and protecting its sovereignty from the waves of colonialism that swept through many other parts of the world.